So the other day I was listening to a talk I gave in 2014. And it's funny how you can listen to it again for the first time because you're different and the person that's speaking is different as well. So I thought I would go over that talk in a way that might be fun, and of course it'll be different because this is 2016. So the talk was, who are you? Who are you? What would you say if the Buddha came up to you and said, who are you? So imagine in your mind that you're sitting in front of the Buddha, and the Buddha is going to ask you this most important question, who are you? And you might say, well, I'm a human. I was born on this earth from human parents, and I have all the characteristics of a human. That's who I am. And then the Buddha would say, but who are you? And then you might say, well, I'm a guy. I have XY chromosomes, and through nature and nurture, I became this guy. And then the Buddha might say, but who are you? And then you might say, well, I'm the soul. I'm the soul. And the Buddha would like that answer, and he would say, well, is your soul eternal? And you would say, yes, of course. Is your soul unchanging and unconditional? And you would say, yes, of course. And then the Buddha would say, well, can you show me where your soul is? Where does it exist? Is it behind your pituitary gland? Next to your heart? In your left hand? And then you might pause and say, well, maybe I'm not the soul. And if there is or isn't a soul, maybe that's not who I really am. And then the Buddha would say, but who are you really? And you might say, being a Buddhist, well, I'm nama-rupa. I'm name and form. And then the Buddha might say, but really, who are you? And then you might say, well, I'm the 32 parts of the body. And the Buddha might say, but that doesn't necessarily include mind. And nama-rupa has both mind and body. And then you might say, I know who I am. I'm the 5 aggregates. Form, sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. I'm all of those in combination in a constant state of flux and change. That I have this form of myself that comes in contact with the form of the world, and that stimulates my consciousness. And my consciousness is composed of, my mind, of consciousness, perception, conception, and volition. Well, the Buddha might test you then and ask you, well, how does that really work? Those 5 aggregates. Can you give me an example? And being proud of your knowledge, you might say, of course. If I'm thirsty, my I form might rest on the form of a water bottle. That's going to stimulate my consciousness, which is a rudimentary consciousness, which is always there. It's with us while we're awake, and it's with us while we're asleep. We have sleeping consciousness and waking consciousness. It never really goes away unless you've had an accident or have altered your brain chemically. So on this blackboard, if you will, of rudimentary consciousness, a sensation arises. And the Buddha recognizes that there are 3 sensations that occur: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And that will stimulate, whether it be pleasant or unpleasant, that will stimulate a perception, a concept. And so we have this concept of water and water bottle. And we know through our education and personal experience that if we are thirsty, the water can satisfy our thirst. But now the volitional activity needs to jump in. The volitional activity is how we get the darn water bottle open. and bring it to our mouth so we can drink it. So at first we were taught how to use a spoon and a fork, and then we're taught how to use a cup. And then as we evolved, we found that there were plastic bottles in the world filled with water. And then we would open the plastic bottle, and we would bring it to our lips, and we would chug-a-lug and satisfy our thirst. And so we have form, sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness being the five aggregates. And the five aggregates basically defines what a human being is. Now, to digress, I find it fascinating that the Buddha never said we are simply one thing. That wasn't necessarily a concept, oneness, at the time of the Buddha. What I think probably was more truthful was the idea of many connected, not simply one. And many connected allows us to have diversity and allows us to have community, and that allows us to grow as a human being. If we don't have that diversity, then we are stuck with the concept of one is the ultimate way of looking at the world, and anybody that doesn't fit into the one needs to be destroyed. And if we destroy all the things that don't fit in the one, then we will have one, and it will be a perfect world. Uniformity is the mantra. And throughout time, if one is interested in time and history, one sees there have been people on this planet who have decided that one is the ultimate number and have worked really hard at eliminating all those who weren't the one. And it still happens today. So what I like about the idea of the ultimate reality in Buddhism is that it allows us to be who we need to be, but it also allows us to come to an understanding that we are community, individuals, not uniformity. We have come together in a very natural way, which I'm coming to. So the Buddha was impressed with this because it meant that you had been listening to what he had said at some point and sort of understood. Now, but the Buddha didn't stop there. He said, okay, but you've given me so many conventional answers, so many relative truths in who you are. Can you give me an ultimate truth of who you are? And then you would pause and reflect. And you would say, yes, the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality, the ultimate me is emptiness. And the Buddha was surprised. He didn't think that was coming because Zen hadn't appeared yet. So the Buddha said, please explain. Why do you think emptiness is your ultimate reality? Well, you might say, I have come to understand that I am empty of independent existence, that I cannot exist unconditionally, that there are certain conditions necessary for me to exist in this world, some of them being food and water and clothing and shelter and medicine, and the list goes on and on and on. And we can do without water for maybe 7 days and without food for maybe 30 days, and shelter is okay if you're living, no shelter might be okay if you're living in Southern California, but you go to Boston and you need shelter. So there are certain things that I can exist for a period of time without, but ultimately I will die. And if you take too many of those away right now, I'll be dead today. For instance, if I choke on a bit of food and can't breathe, in a couple minutes, I'm history. Just ask Mama Cass. So, here we are defining ourselves as being empty. And the Buddha said, I can understand that. I talked about something similar called anatta, not self. That this idea of who we are stems from the gift we've been given as humans called ego, or sense of self, necessary to live in this very complicated world. That the ego seems to be more like a funnel than anything else, with one big end and one small end. Something maybe like a megaphone. And we have our 6 sense doors bringing in all this information every moment of every day in the big end of the megaphone. And somehow it gets condensed enough to come out the small end. And what's coming out is the important stuff necessary for our survival. And once our survival has been met, then we can tune ourselves in to the other information that's available to us. And somebody said, maybe the Buddha and maybe Christ, you know, feed them first before you tell them what you think. They're not going to be able to hear what you say if they're hungry. So sometimes we need to satisfy our survival, lose our fear, and come to the present moment in a relaxed and aware way. Now, even if we have access to all the information, we are still limited because our access is dependent on human sense doors. So if I was a dog, I could hear better. If I was a hawk, I could see better. You know? And yet, I'm limited to my human sense doors and my human experience. So I have that in common with all the people I'm connected to. That we all have this, to some extent, similar experience of the world. As we get older, we have to amplify our sense doors with, you know, glasses, going from single vision to bifocal to trifocal. And then if we get old enough, we get to have our cataracts taken out and we go back to 20/20 for a while. Our sense doors are always changing. The information that's being sent through them is always changing. So we can mark our life by our sense doors and how acute they were at certain times. So when I was 12, I had pretty good vision. And I had much more strength and agility than I do now. So I can mark it. And that's called, of course, being young, being middle-aged, and being old. Now, Reverend Shanti's not old yet. But I have crossed the line. I get Social Security. So in our culture, I am designated as an old person. And I must say, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Yet. But my old age is still unfolding in a very interesting way. My boundaries are being increased. Sometimes I can't walk as far as I used to, can't run as fast as I used to. But I can sleep more than I used to. And that's one of the benefits of old age. Now, this emptiness thing. This is really a fascinating concept that Zen came up with, because the Buddha said anatta, not self, and Zen took it just a little bit further. Not only do we not have a permanent unconditional self, but nothing is what it seems to be, because nothing has an essence or an originality or an independence. That everything is conditional, even the chair. So if we take the back and arms off a chair, we have a stool. We've created something different. If we take the legs off the stool, we have something that's broken. We've created something different. We are faced with having to understand through perception the world around us. And in doing so, we have given it a name. A name helps us identify the separateness, the illusion of separateness. So the chair is independent from the wall and the carpet, and therefore the chair can exist. If the chair were one with the carpet and the wall, none of the three could exist. We wouldn't have a word for that. So we've been given this wonderful vocabulary in English. I think there's like 500,000 words, if we really work hard, that we could acquire, to separate our world in 500,000 different ways. And of course, each time we do that, what we're faced with is the fear of being separate. It's an uncomfortable feeling because we can no longer be part of the world around us intellectually. And that's the price we pay for naming and understanding the world through our intellect. But through our meditation practice, we can understand the world intuitively. We can transcend the names and not see oneness, but see how all things are connected. You can literally see that, not with your eyes, but with your heart. Your eyes can only see the separateness, but your heart can see the connection. And that's why in some forms of Zen, they say the ultimate reality is experienced through heart-mind. Through a combination of intellect and intuition, we can experience the world the way it really is. And reconnect and not feel separate and have a wonderful sense of peace and place. So we struggle for that. We struggle for that. And sometimes we try to annihilate the intellect through intoxication to become one with the universe. Not so good. Sometimes we try to kill the ego in meditation. Not so good. Because the ego is our friend. The ego is the mechanism that allows us to live in this very complicated world as a human being. And if we were in some way to be able to kill the ego, we would now be dependent on everything around us for our survival, because we couldn't exist separately. The illusion of separateness. So the idea, it seems to me, is this, that in our meditation practice and in our understanding of Dharma, what we want to do is transcend the self, not descend into a primordial oneness, but transcend into a interconnected, interdependent reality that allows us to experience the present moment of our life in a realistic way. And in the realistic way we are experiencing ourselves in a transcendent moment, we no longer suffer, because we're no longer separate, and there's nothing to suffer, no one to suffer. It is simply an experience of the world that hasn't been given that moniker, that designation. So, can we experience the world and not suffer? Can we come to a profound acceptance of the way the world is and understand it is exactly the way it needs to be in this moment? Therefore, we come to a place of compassion and wisdom, clarity and kindness. Now, the clarity is that everything is the way it's supposed to be. The kindness aspect is, well, there are people suffering over there, even though that's how it's supposed to be. And I have chosen the path of clarity and kindness. Therefore, I am going to try to help the people that are suffering because of kindness. Not because it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. This is a really interesting idea that Buddhism has come up with, as opposed to perhaps the Catholic tradition. You know? So Buddhism says you help them because they're suffering. And you reduce their suffering, perhaps by meeting some of their needs. And if you can't afford to meet their needs, maybe you can help them suffer less by simply being in their presence and listening. And confirming the fact that all humans suffer. That you are not a victim, you are not the only one. It happens to all of us. And as we get older and older and older, we have seen it time and time again. All the suffering in the world that manifests because of the illusion of independence, the illusion of thinking you have the ability to change the world the way it is. The Buddhists would say, no, the world simply is the way it is. We call it samsara. It's where birth and death occur, and in between birth and death, suffering happens. That's the way the world has always been and always will be. But the beings in the world, the humans in the world, we can help them reduce their suffering. Perhaps not by telling them what to do, but by showing them what to do. And in that, showing them what you do to end your suffering, which might stimulate them to end their suffering. And it might not. And because your attachment is minimal at this point, you're not attached to the goal, you're attached to the journey. You don't become despondent because they're not seeing the path and reaching the goal. You simply allow them to start where they're at, and they ultimately, given enough lifetimes, will figure it out. Maybe even in this lifetime. So, the Buddha, who are you? And I think each one of us, whether we're meditators or not, have to figure that out for ourselves. Nobody can tell us who we are. They can suggest. They might tell us who they think they are. But it's up to us through practice and personal experience to define ourselves. Now, word of warning, in defining yourself, in the very next moment, it'll be different. So it's an ongoing definition that ultimately doesn't come to an end. But it does give us something to do. Thank you for listening. Would anybody like to comment on what I've said or have any answers to who they are?
At times I feel days, sometimes a week of interconnectedness in a very powerful way with everything and everyone around me. But I live in a society that promotes and seems to chastise me for not being individual and not being exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about helping me when I find that happening. I find it hard sometimes to get back to the feeling of interconnectedness with everything.
Yeah, I have found some of the characteristics of interconnectedness. Walking into a room, seeing a bunch of strangers, and they all look familiar. Now, that may sound really good to begin with, that you're not fearful because they're strangers, that you're in there because they look familiar and maybe you have interacted with them before. But if they think you're a stranger and you don't, there is a tension that's created in the relationship because they have to get to know you. So you have to pretend you don't know them, even though you don't know them. But they feel like friends. And I find this fascinating. And then you get into, cultural diversity too. And you might be living in Koreatown, and there's a bunch of Koreans, and then you feel one with the Koreans, and they look at you, and you still look like a Caucasian. And you go, okay, now how can I honor the connection we have? What do I need to do? Sometimes you honor it by not feeling connected, allowing them to be who they need to be, and come to a place of understanding that we have a variety of humans walking on this earth. And we're all connected at some level through a multitude of connections. It's never just one. And they feel more comfortable. So I'm sitting on the porch and a Korean woman walks by walking her dog. And I smile and go, hi. And she turns away. And I just have to smile to myself and go, okay, well, we're all connected, but it's obvious to some and not so much to others. And so I have to allow them to walk their dog and not be connected to me sitting on the porch. And it's okay. I think the feeling of personal disconnection happens when we're afraid and we go into survival mode. And now it's me against the world. And I have to make sure that I am providing for myself before I provide for others. Now, there's two different ways you can break through that. One is get married and have some kids. And you're never going to provide for yourself ever again. It's going to be for them. And another way to experience it is to meditate. And they have that transcendent experience and realize through that experience that we are genuinely all interconnected and interdependent. And then they become first and you become second. And that's the path of the Bodhisattva. It's also the path of the Arhat. You know, so there are a couple ways to do it, but for me the ultimate reality has never been one, it's always been many, connected, but generally it's not obvious to the many. It's more obvious just to the one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
I can kind of understand the personal, how you can feel connected or disconnected, but when you watch the news about, say, for instance, Black Lives Matter or the ISIS, what's going on, it's actually hard to feel connected 100% to. I mean, you feel disconnected or displaced because it's very hard to analyze. For me, anyway. So I have no. There's a kind of a disconnect between, maybe my personal, intuitive or whatever, idealistic feelings and how to handle, the what's going on in bigger society. I can't quite put the two together. I mean, here it's easier, this is a self-selected group, but once you walk outside or whatever, it's different.
I brought this concept up, I was giving a talk at a conservative Jewish high school. And I brought this concept up as we're all interconnected and interdependent. And one of the girls raised her hand and said, "You mean I'm connected to Adolf Hitler?" And I said, "Yes." And everybody just went crazy. I was never invited back, by the way. I think what we're seeing when we see ISIS or all the other terrible stuff out there is we're seeing our own potential. That all that stuff is in us. But we are cultivators. We are either preventing it from arising or abandoning it when it does arise. We are holding on to the good stuff and creating more of it in our practice. And that's like a mirror reflecting back who we are. The shadow, I guess they call it. So, if that's the case, yes, we need to honor that that's a possibility for all human beings because human beings are doing it. And then the individual response would be, but I'm not going to do that. And that self and other then plays there's a certain tension between self and other, which turns out to be a boundary. Not a bad one, but a good one, allowing us to be who we need to be and not be them. And either through practice or understanding or through our intuitive nature, we understand that that's not conducive to the end of suffering. That only creates more suffering. So I would say ISIS is not bad. ISIS leads to more suffering. And for Buddhism, that's not the direction we want to go in. We want to create less suffering in the world. Something to play with as you watch the news. I think the best way to watch the news is to turn off the TV. Just my opinion.